Okay, today I'm going to talk about chapter one of The Future of an Illusion. I'll just introduce the first chapter, and in the next lecture I'll explain kind of the big picture of The Future of an Illusion. Uh, the Future of an Illusion is Freud's. It's a great book. It was written in 1927, and it's basically Freud's account, his view of religion. Okay, so let me go over the very first chapter. Uh, Chapter one is very important. I mean, basically, it's the key to the rest of the book. Let me read the very first sentence of the first chapter. When one has lived for quite a long time in a particular civilization and has often tried to discover what its origins were and along what path it has developed, one sometimes also feels tempted to take a glance in the other direction and to ask what further fate lies before it and what transformations it is destined to undergo. Okay, that's the very first sentence of the book. When he says when one has lived for quite a long time in a particular civilization, he's talking about himself. And the civilization he's talking about is European civilization. So Freud, at this point, Freud is getting old. He's in his 60s. He's getting older. He's spent his whole life looking back at the past, examining the past of not only of civilization, but also of the past of individuals. Freud was a psychoanalyst. He was the father of psychoanalysis, and basically psychoanalysis was a type of a therapy in which patients would come to Freud and they would recount their past, memories of their past, and Freud would ultimately all their problems, their psychological problems and so on, would go to the past, to their childhood, around what he called the Oedipal phase, around when they're five years old. So Freud was obsessed with the past, not only the past of individuals, but also the past of history. He loved to collect antiques, and he also wrote books about the past. One book, for example, Totem and Taboo, is a study of ancient civilizations and the origin of civilization. So Freud, at this point, he's older now. He now wants to look towards the future. When one has lived in a particular civilization and has often tried to discover the origins of the past and how it has developed, it's now time, he says, to turn your gaze towards the future. And that's what he's doing in this book. He's going to write, that's why it's called The Future of an Illusion. He's interested in examining the future of civilization, and to try to determine its future direction, and to ask what further fate lies behind it and what transformations it is destined to undergo. So that's basically how the book begins. It begins with Freud, who now wants to direct his attention towards the future of civilization. He spent years looking to the past. Now he wants to look to the future and to understand and to try to determine what's going to happen in the future of civilization. So if you think of draw a circle like this, and this will stand for civilization. And so what Freud is interested in, what his hope is, his desire is to determine or to think about or to reflect on the future of civilization, all of it. Okay, and so he wants to direct his attention towards the future of civilization. That's his desire. So the book, he begins his book telling you what his desire is, what he wants to do. The interesting thing is, in The Future of an Illusion, is that once he tells you what he wants to do, he immediately tells you why he can't do what he wants to do. He presents three different reasons why it's going to be difficult to do this, to talk about the future of civilization. One is that he doesn't know enough. He's ignorant, too ignorant. To talk about the future of civilization would mean you'd need to be an expert in many, many fields. He's an expert in psychoanalysis and psychology, but he's not an expert in all the other fields that you would require of one person to reflect on the future of civilization. So that's one problem. He doesn't know enough. The second problem is, so the first problem is ignorance. He doesn't know enough to talk about the future of civilization as a whole. The next one is bias. He says everyone is biased, meaning that everyone has certain either pessimistic by temperament or optimistic, And if you're optimistic, you're going to have a rosy kind of picture of what's going to happen in the future. If you're pessimistic, you'll tend to see the future pessimistically. So everyone is biased. Everyone has emotional biases, and that's going to make it very difficult to give an objective view of the future. A third problem that he mentions about why it's impossible to accomplish what he wants to do is that we experience our present naively. He's saying if we don't even understand what's happening in the present, we experience the present naively. If we don't, meaning that we don't really understand the significance of what's going on now until the future evolves, and then we could, with hindsight, we could look back. For example, think of the coronavirus, for example. Now it's a big deal nowadays. But when it first started out, like say last year in September, October, November, when you started hearing little stories, January, nobody really took it that seriously because we were experiencing our present naively. Now, when we look back from the present to the past, we can now understand what some of those things meant. These little stories about the coronavirus. Now we understand the significance of them. So that's another problem. We experience the present naively. So these are three big problems. Freud says he's too ignorant to talk about the future of civilization. He has emotional biases, and we all experience our present naively. Meaning, if we can't even understand the present, how are we going to understand the future? And another thing he mentions is that all predictions of the future are necessarily very uncertain because they're predictions. So what Freud does in chapter 1 of Future of Illusion, he starts the book out by telling you what his desire is, and then he immediately tells you why he can't do what he wants to do. So what he says he's going to do, instead of talking about the future of civilization as a whole, he's just going to pick a little part of it, a little part of civilization, the part that he knows something about. And he's a psychologist, and he's studied psychology. He knows a lot about psychology. He's also very interested in religion. So he's going to focus on something he knows about. He says he's going to pick out a small tract of territory. So just a little, he's going to take a little piece of the pie and talk about that, the future of a little piece of the pie. But it's very misleading in a way, the way I put this, because the piece of the pie that he's going to talk about is not like just any piece of the pie. It's really, he says, it's the key piece of the pie. So the little part of civilization he's going to talk about is kind of I'll put it right in the center, because it's the key to all of civilization. He doesn't tell you what the key is right now, but it's going to be religion. It's Freud's view, and Freud was an atheist. Freud believed that if you want to understand civilization, you have to understand religion, because religion is the key to civilization. Okay, so that's basically how the book is. That's how the book starts out. He's going to take a little piece of the pie, and it's going to turn out to be religion. It's a small tract of territory, but it's a key part. Now, since he's going to be talking about civilization and religion as being a key to civilization, what he does. The next thing he does is to offer a little definition of civilization. He tells you what he means by it. He says human civilization, and he tells you exactly what he means. Human civilization, by which I mean all those respects in which human life has raised itself above its animal status and differs from the life of beasts. And then he says, and I scorn to distinguish between culture and religion. Okay, so that's what he means by civilization. It's all the ways in which human life has raised itself above its animal status and differs from the life of beasts. So if you think of all the ways in which man or human beings have risen above the beasts, that's civilization. So think of, we build roads, we build dams, we build cities, we have science, we send men to the moon, we have schools, we extract wealth from the ground, we create technology, we have art, we have music. All of this for Freud is civilization. All the ways in which human beings have risen above the life of the beast. That's what he means by civilization. And it's an encompassing concept. And then he says, I scorn to distinguish between culture and civilization. So Freud, and then he just says this parenthetically, doesn't explain why, but let me briefly explain why. So Freud says when he's talking about civilization, he's not distinguishing it from culture. And he says he scorns to make this distinction. This distinction is at the very heart of European Western thought. It goes back to the Greeks. Think of Aristotle and Plato and the philosophers and the playwrights and the artists. They were all on the side of culture. On the other hand, on the side of civilization were the workers, the people doing the dirty work. Think of Plato and Aristotle writing their philosophy. They could not have done that if they had to get their hands dirty and work all day and dig ditches, right? So basically, the idea is this. Culture represents the higher values. And civilization represents the lower values. Culture represents the intellect. It represents imagination. It represents creativity. Civilization is the dirty work represents just labor, getting your hands dirty, so on the one hand, culture deals with the higher quests, the higher pursuits, the quest for beauty, the quest for truth. Civilization represents just labor, common everyday labor, with no concern for higher pursuits. Freud says he scorns this distinction. So culture for Freud is part of civilization. The higher values, the so-called higher cultural values for Freud, if you want to understand them, you have to locate them within the lower values. And that's one reason why a lot of people did not like Freud. They thought he didn't appreciate the higher values. He's reducing the higher values of beauty and truth and so on to lower things. Like, for example, in the case of Freud, to sexual desires and to aggressive impulses. So basically, you're taking the higher goals of culture, and you're saying, they're really not as great as you think. They're really rooted in the body and in the lower aspects of civilization. That was one reason why a lot of people didn't like Freud. Anyway, so Freud rejects this whole distinction between civilization and culture. The next thing, so basically, then he says civilization has two aspects. There's two aspects of civilization. First of all, it's concerned with controlling nature. Freud, in this book, nature is going to be an enemy. It's something that civilization has to control. So basically, think of civilization is concerned with controlling nature. We build dams, we build houses to protect ourselves against the forces of nature. We have to control nature and then extract wealth. Think gold and metals and so on. We extract it, we use it to build technology, to build buildings and so on. That's one aspect of civilization. The second aspect of civilization is once we have extracted this wealth, we need to distribute it. So we need to come up with social institutions. Now, so basically, this is how it starts out. Civilization's on one side, nature's on the other side. We're on the side of civilization, so we're basically friends. Civilization is our friend because it protects us against nature. It turns out, though, very quickly that we ourselves are enemies of civilization because we don't like it. Why? Well, because of the burdens it imposes on us, because of too many laws, too many prohibitions. So this is within 2 pages of the book, this is the situation. Civilization is surrounded by enemies. On the one hand, surrounded by nature. On the other hand, it's surrounded by individuals like us who don't like civilization and are a threat to civilization. And that's how the book starts out. In the next lecture, I'll develop it a little more. But this is how the book starts out. Civilization is at war not only with nature, but with us, individuals. And the next chapter, the first chapter, I'll develop it a little more.